Dor Abrahamson is going to talk to us about perceptual judgment and Peirce in mathematics.
Well, thank you very much. Well, let's see, I do know most people here, actually, but I'm from the Grad School of Education. I'm a member of the Faculty of Cognition and Development. And the talk today is called The Abduction of Peirce, the Missing Link Between Perceptual Judgment and Mathematical Reasoning. Actually, the notes I wrote turned out to be more apt than I thought because I arrived here and the place was locked. So here we go. So say I'm a professor from Mars. Well, that's not too difficult to imagine. Some of my students think that anyway. But say, just for argument's sake, that I was indeed a professor from Mars. I walk into my normal classroom next Tuesday at 3:10 p.m. and to my great puzzlement, I see nobody else there. Now, truth be told, this has actually happened to me today as well. So it's not that conjectural or bizarre an idea. It's branded in my episodic memory. But anyway, there I am, a week from now, on December 16th, 2008, at 3:10 p.m., in 3635 Tolman Hall. The seconds are ticking away, and nobody but me is in the room. Now, if still back at home, I was familiar with the simple rule that during break, there is no school. And if I were not too spaced out that day, as professors from Mars are wont to be, and I actually acknowledged the fact that it was break that day, then I would know that there is no school on that day, December 16th. And so I would never have shown up to begin with. That's called deduction. It's a type of logical operation. You know the rule, if A, then B, or if case A, then result B. That is, you know that during break, there's no school. And you notice and recognize that you're now dealing with an instance of a case of a day that is indeed during break, a day when the if A, then B rule should obtain. And so you apply the rule to the case and determine that specifically today there is no school. So we have a general rule, if case A, then result B. That is, if today's break, today there is no school, or just during break there's no school. We have a specific case, today is break, and so we determine, or well, we deduce the result of applying the if A, then B rule to the case. That is, we come to know that today there is no school. But then again, my being from Mars and knowing little about human nature, again, a personality trait my students would possibly agree about, well, I just don't happen to know the rule that over break there's no school. All I have is the fact that the class is empty and a deep sentiment of Martian puzzlement. Now, if I was a full professor from Mars, not just a measly assistant professor from Mars, then presumably over the years it would often happen to me that I show up in class and find it empty. So perhaps at some point I would also note that on all these occasions it was break time. Then, given the result that the class is empty and the case that it is winter break, I might induce that next time a break comes along, my class would be empty again. That is, on the basis of an observed association between the result and the case, and given a general motivation to avoid showing up to empty classes, I would conjecture the rule that during break, there is no school. This indeed would only be a conjecture, that is, an assertion whose truth value is still contingent on a thorough evaluation of its validity, a working proposition that is perhaps plausible, possible, or even probable, but is yet inconclusive. That's called induction, establishing a proposed rule on the basis of observing recurring matches between properties of a particular situation and that which might be thought of as a more global state of affairs that is taken to somehow explain or even cause the situation at hand. It's different from deduction, right? Deduction goes ineluctably from a case to result, if A, then B. Whereas induction goes, we have B, and we see that the conditions are A, so is it a rule that if A, then B? Perhaps let's look into this. Now, much of science, if not all of science, if you take Karl Popper's position, is just that. We build models, and as long as we cannot falsify them, we take them to be our best shot at truth, even though we can never know for certain whether or not some sunny day these models will be shattered. In fact, Popper insisted that a model is worthy of science if and only if it specifies conditions under which we could choose to repudiate the model and move on to a better one. In sum, induction is the conjecturing of a rule based on the observation of a pattern of associations between candidate cases and results. Then, if the induced rule is taken to obtain, and one's criteria for that are contingent on the social nature of the situation, which may range from the trivial mundane to the rigorous scientific. But anyhow, if the induced rule is taken to obtain, then hitherto you would use this rule deductively. Thus, induction leads to the opportunity for deduction. But wait a moment. What then leads to induction? So we said that a deduction is the application of a rule to a case to get a result, and induction is the conjecturing of such a rule based on emergent association, possibly a causal association between features of observed situations that we come to see as cases leading to results. So what is abduction? Let's begin from who came up with this weird word. Well, Charles Sanders Peirce, a true blue American who lived between 1839 and 1914, was an intellectual omnibus whose multidisciplinary, really staggeringly multidisciplinary work ranged from science to philosophy and everything in between. And whatever this Renaissance person did was somehow groundbreaking. Amongst his many monumental achievements, he's considered the father of semiotics, the study of sign, what it is and how humans make sense of it, learn it and use it. But to get back to the question of what leads to induction, Peirce noted that any inductive process sprouts from a moment of limbo, when the world momentarily makes no sense at all. Actually, I feel that way a lot of the time. That moment, just before we have a selected candidate case that could explain this situation we have encountered as a contingent result. So this is before we could explore this proposed association as a hypothesized rule, that is, inductively, etc. Yet how do we first chance upon the proposed association that leads up to the inductive hypothesizing? Well, note that the professor from Mars did not see an empty classroom in a vacuum. Rather, he came into the classroom expecting it to be full of his many grateful, beaming students. So he was generally surprised by the empty classroom and thus enters a cognitive orientation mode in an attempt to figure out what's going on. Now, one might say that at least tacitly, this professor from Mars harbors the rule that some scheduling systems govern activities on this planet, right? I mean, that's why he himself is in the classroom just now, because it is, well, Tuesday, 3:10. So the professor from Mars might think, and I'm translating loosely from Martian, gosh, nobody showed up to my class today. If only there was something special about today that somehow qualifies the scheduling that I took to be immutable. Now, what do I know about this planet? What patterns might inform my tacit Bayesian reasoning? Anyway, did Peirce know Thomas Bayes? Not bloody likely. Bayes died 68 years before Peirce was born. Okay, so back to this planet. What have I experienced here? These slackers sometimes take time off, so perhaps this empty classroom could be the result of applying that time off rule to this case of today. That is, if today is into break time and there is a general rule by which during break there's no school, then it would make sense that nobody's here. In fact, the very meaning of break is probably just that. I mean, well, that there's no instruction, right? So, in a sense, abduction is backwards deduction. We have a general rule suggesting how some situation before us could possibly be taken to be a result of a case, but we're not sure whether or not the situation is indeed an application of that general rule, because we're not sure whether or not that case actually exists in our particular situation. In a nutshell, we know that if A then B, and we know that we have a B, but so we cannot know for sure whether or not this B is the result of A, because we haven't yet even seen any evidence of A being around. Moreover, B might be the result of something else. That is, the rule if A then B does not specify if and only if A then B. Maybe B is there due to C, D, or Z. In terms of mathematical functions, if that's what rocks your boat, it's working backwards from the domain to the source and hoping to strike lucky, and strike lucky consistently. In any event, now that we have the candidate rule, we can embark upon the inductive process, where we put the rule to the empirical testing and then evaluate whether or not the rule stood this testing and thus whether the rule might become, through the leap of inductive faith, our new standard that we then apply deductively in new situations. Specifically, our professor from Mars might just learn to stay home next Tuesday if it falls during break. So what's all this fuss about abduction? We can use it, can we use it beyond analyzing the mishaps of Martian scholars? Well, actually, there are philosophers of science who believe that abduction is not an oddity, but in fact the only way human discovery can move forward. How we get a toehold in the seeming chaos of empiricism, out of which patterns emerge and inform our analysis, discovery, and explanation. Otherwise, we'd be forever locked within the set of existing rules and variations upon these rules, but we would not have the logical wherewithal to break loose of those deductions and come up ex nihilo with new insights. So if that is true, and to the extent that we're all scientists of sort, well, cognitive scientists, social scientists, learning scientists, you know, in the graduate school of education we have science envy. But in any case, to the extent that we all do cutting-edge research that takes our field beyond that which we already know, Peirce reckons we're abducting. Birds do it, bees do it, professors from planet Earth do it. So let's all abduct. So why do I care about all of this? Why should you be inflicted with all of this? After all, I'm a professor of education, and hey, isn't education precisely about conveying to people that which is already known? That which is not cutting edge, but, well, blunt edge knowledge? Aren't schools the one place when we all wish to avoid the situation that kids are all confused in states of cognitive limbo? Is not school the specific institution charged with parceling up ready-made cultural legacies that we then neatly teaspoon-feed our passive students? Those were rhetorical questions, in case you missed the tone of these, or if these notes appear in print. Well, perhaps education used to be so, and perhaps it actually still appears to be so. But many of us, going back to John Dewey and William James, perceive education as an enterprise that supports the training of people to think, not just to receive information passively. An enterprise seeking to create situations in which content makes sense to students because they figured it out themselves. They reinvented the cultural knowledge, so to speak. At least the students are guided to experience subjective reinventing of their cultural heritage. I'm not talking about putting kids in a room with a view and saying, go ahead, reinvent the wheel, I'm going for coffee. Bye. No, I'm speaking about designing carefully crafted learning environments, including objects, suggested activities, and a climate of inquiry, eagerness, reflection, respect, and collaboration that create opportunities for students to bring to bear their personal and collective wherewithal in coming to articulate the content and forms of knowledge that we have selected and ordained as particularly useful for these young minds to become empowered as agents of positive change in their own and shared destiny. Heck, as individuals who might just save our species from the manifold trajectories of self-destruction that us elders cannot seem to abort. Okay, my homily is over, but you get the drift, right? Let me just add in this grandiose tone by citing Dewey, who struggled with the question of how to make education democratic, honest, engaging, and yet effective. That was a century ago, and we're still working on that problem. That's what gives us jobs over the Graduate School of Education, so perhaps we're not too eager to solve the problems. And I just got an email today calling for chapters in an edited volume about the US struggle to reconcile equity and quality. And the TIMSS 2007 International Report came out this morning showing that the US is behind 8 Asian countries in terms of 4th grade and 5th and 8th grade students' mathematical achievements. That tells a story, right? But anyway, here's what Dewey says in Democracy in Education back in 1916. The point at issue in a theory of educational value is then the unity or integrity of experience. How shall it be full and varied without losing unity of spirit? How shall it be one and yet not narrow and monotonous in its unity? Ultimately, the question of values and the standard of values is the moral question in the organization of the interests of life. Educationally, the question concerns that organization of schools, materials, and method which will operate to achieve breadth and richness of experience. How shall we secure breadth of outlook without sacrificing efficiency of execution? How shall we secure the diversity of interests without paying the price of isolation? How shall the individual be rendered executive in his intelligence instead of at the cost of his intelligence? How shall art, science, and politics reinforce one another in an enriched temper of mind instead of constituting ends pursued at one another's expense? How can the interests of life and the studies which enforce them enrich the common experience of men instead of dividing men from one another? Rosie, if you'd like to come sit here. Yeah. But more specific to the subject matter content of mathematics, which is where my research on human cognition and development happens to lie, Dewey says, actually a few pages earlier, mathematics is said to have, for example, disciplinary value in habituating the pupil to accuracy of statement and closeness of reasoning. It has utilitarian value in giving command of the arts of calculation involved in trade and the arts. Culture value in its enlargement of the imagination in dealing with the most general relations of things. Even religious value in its concept of the infinite and allied ideas. But clearly mathematics does not accomplish such results because it is endowed with miraculous potencies called values. It has these values if and when it accomplishes these results, and not otherwise. The statements may help a teacher to a larger vision of the possible results to be affected by instruction in mathematical topics. But unfortunately, the tendency is to treat the statement as indicating powers inherently residing in the subject, whether they operate or not, and thus to give it a rigid justification. If they do not operate, the blame is put not on the subject as taught, but on the indifference and recalcitrancy of pupils." End quote. Okay, so how indeed might the individual student be rendered executive in her intelligence instead of at the cost of her intelligence? Or, and to dive into the theoretical puzzle as I see it, how are we to implement with integrity our current pedagogical vision, such that individuals can reinvent the cultural tools such as mathematical notions and procedures that we have selected for them as worthy of their time, energy, engagement, and practice? I think Peirce's construct of abduction can contribute to our understanding, justification, routinization of learning environments in which students reinvent the selected cultural heritage. Specifically, abduction is critical for an explication of what goes on during that moment when the student is at that proverbial limbo, when the world breaks down, when tacit expectations are thwarted, and as Heidegger says, though with a heavy Heidelberg accent, the environment announces itself afresh. Namely, for me, the premise that abduction actually exists and is ubiquitous legitimizes the types of reform-based learning environments we are advocating and researching, because the construct of abduction situates these forms of reasoning we are targeting within a larger system of logical reasoning. Moreover, arguments to the effect that scientific progress depends on abduction are helpful, because they support our pedagogical philosophy that students should learn to think, to develop habits of mind and dispositions that will serve them both through the K through 12 trajectory, but hopefully far beyond. We're hoping to democratize scientific reasoning and not just scientific factoids. But that's all on the pragmatic front of my research. On the theoretical side, there's an entirely different story. I'm about to tell you that side of the story and to give away the punchline for the benefit of those very few here of you who didn't happen to download my manuscript and read every one of its 40 single-spaced pages. The punchline is that the construct of abduction is helping me make sense of how the two main theoretical strands in research on learning, a cognitivist strand and a sociocultural strand, fit well together. That is, I'm calling abduction the missing link between perceptual judgments and mathematical reasoning. But because I'm speaking both about the pragmatics of learning and about theory of learning, and especially because I'm about to discuss some empirical data of kids who are working and abducting with mathematical artifacts that you probably haven't seen before, perhaps I should slip in a quick word about the nature of my work. So, am I a teacher, an inventor, a researcher? Well, the sad truth is that I'm a bit of each. The type of work I do has come to be known as design-based research, and it's been around for a couple of decades now, which is fortunate for an aspiring academic hoping to build a career from tinkering around with such weapons of math instruction, as I've come to think of these elaborate devices when I'm traveling to conferences and get questions about all this stuff in my carry-on bag. That is, I design new mathematical objects in order to pursue my research, which for the main is about the nature of mathematical intuition, mathematical reasoning, and mathematical learning, and the roles that artifacts play in enabling students to develop mathematical notions by building on their personal resources, such as perceptual judgments, logical operations, and basic fluency in discursive norms and sensitivity to the pragmatics of communication. Now, whereas empirical research in the cognitive sciences naturally involves experimental design, including the creation of all sorts of instruments that are crafted to ultimately elicit the data needed to address a research question, in my case, these instruments I create are more often than not new types of instructional materials that I naively conjecture will create opportunities for students to confront core issues of some targeted mathematical subject matter content. Now, why, you may ask, do I even bother to build new learning tools when there are plenty of materials out there, right? Well, here's where it gets interesting. In design-based research, the researcher often departs from a conjecture as to the nature of some mechanism, usually a cognitive mechanism, but possibly an instructional methodology or discursive practice, etc. Some mechanism that, if only it were engaged in classrooms, we believe we'd see more learning occurring. So here's the rub. Unlike an ethnographer, say, who explores some existing system of practice, such as the classroom, so as to learn about the system of practice that the system of practice that the design-based researcher wishes to explore, well, it just doesn't exist yet. It doesn't exist precisely because nobody anywhere is teaching in those very ways that, the researcher believes, would lead to great learning, and to the researcher's everlasting glory, of course. So, what do you do when you cannot research a site because that site doesn't exist? Well, you create that empirical environment, and that is precisely what we do. We design and build objects or systems of practice that come as close as possible to our ideal of how things might be. and then investigate the consequences of these interventions. And just like in industrial design, where we build the best air vessels that our aeronautic theory permits, and then we study the flight of those vessels to evaluate and improve our theory, only to modify the theory and therefore create improved vessels that we try out, etc. Just so in education, we investigate the flight, if you will, of our best educational vessels, so as to improve our educational theory, and round and around. So we speak of the iterated cycles of designing, building, testing, analyzing, improving our theory, and over. In a sense, our artifacts converge on embodying our theory. For the most in this conversation we're having here today, well, this monologue for the time being, but hopefully it will become a dialogue or even a symposium, I'd like to show you a selection of some of these instructional materials we've been developing over the past decade, and to explain how activities with these objects exemplify the idea of the missing link between personal resources and cultural knowledge. But just before this circus act begins, let me offer a quick sense of the two types of theoretical models of learning that are commonly portrayed in the learning sciences as vying, yet I believe on the basis of evidence of witnessing abduction among school children, are not vying but are actually complementary. Not that I'm the first to argue for the complementarity of these cognitivist and socio-cultural perspectives, but there isn't much work around that argues for this complementarity empirically. So here we go, the last stretch of chatter before we look at the artifacts and the data. The main research program of education researchers, who are often characterized as cognitivists, is to determine the nature, structure, and function of the mental entities that develop as individuals grow and undergo various experiences, and in particular as they interact with specific phenomena in more or less controlled situations. So, for example, we might ask, if it so happens that we are interested in the content of probability and statistics, what enables a person to cope with the randomness inherent in natural phenomena, so as to nevertheless make effective predictions despite this randomness? How does this notion develop? What are human strategies? What are the potential pitfalls inherent to such strategies? What are the conditions under which such strategies might be manipulated, etc.? So yes, the cognitivists would never deny that there are objects and people around us. And some cognitive scientists, in fact, examine how individual reasoning becomes distributed over objects and people so as to enhance mental capacity and enable complex collaborations. But the focus is on cerebral unit of analyses, and a certain developmental determinism unfolds, given sufficient stimuli and task-oriented behaviors. But a sociocultural researcher instead might look at the cultural manifestations around notions of randomness, including the history and use of any relevant artifacts, the forms of practice for coping with uncertainty, the types of dispositions and beliefs that such social installations foster, and the malleability and susceptibility of the cultural infrastructure that support practices which include attention to randomness. According to the sociocultural agenda, a child learns about randomness, say, through participating in organized practice that mediates the cultural heritage pertaining to the phenomena embodying randomness. This practice would quite likely include artifacts, and the child comes to understand that which we might call the content by learning to engage in these practices, first vicariously and then actively. These tools, in turn, become internalized as forms of reasoning that tacitly incorporate abstracted mental vestiges of the physical actions and can thus be carried over from one domain of practice to another. Once again, the socioculturalist does not, for the most, deny that individuals have minds, but the contents of these minds are implicated as intrinsically social, and that every iota of an individual's thoughts is inextricably woven into the fabric of the social tapestry. Moreover, articulated thought is inherently linguistic, and so without language, the crowning glory of cultural achievement, there would be no thought. We'd be back in caves, grunting away. So, those were obviously caricatures of theoretical models, but not gross caricatures. The main point here, though, is that these positions set different agendas for research, and in any case, they may be expected to inform different pedagogical outlooks on what it might take to foster the development of mathematical reasoning. For example, a pedagogical perspective that is informed by cognitive science description of the complexity of the simplest of ideas might recommend that students should be supported in painstakingly reinventing mathematical ideas, because otherwise their cognitive structures would be ruptured. There would be a disconnect between the schemas they enter the classroom with and the solution procedures they are asked to engage in practice. In a word, the students may learn how to use the mathematical meaning of these procedures, if you will, but they would never quite make sense of these procedures. That is, the procedures would remain opaque constructions that are not grounded in any clear prior knowledge or any familiar images. A socioculturalist, on the other hand, may be completely unperturbed by such symbol grounding questions and consider a student's fluent and timely use of a solution procedure as marking the successful acculturation into the system of human practice that includes mathematical tools that are instrumentalized towards the accomplishment of collective goals. Again, I must quickly say that there are no clear alignments between theories of learning on the one hand and pedagogical perspectives on the other hand. And in any case, the recent decades have seen the sprouting of hybrid perspectives. But all that notwithstanding, I have yet to see a comprehensive theory that accounts for ontological development in the social milieu. And just to demonstrate that these questions are current, not just my whimsical cogitations from this morning, I'd like to cite from the editor's notes in the most recent issue of the Journal of Cognition and Instruction, arguably the premier journal of our field. Andy DeStessa, the incoming editor-in-chief of the journal, writes in that note, and I quote, "I would like cognition and instruction to be the home of a new movement in educational research, which I call dialectical approaches to cognition. I expect to write and speak more about this direction in other places, but the nutshell story is that I believe that there has been an unfortunate split between cognitive and sociocultural researchers in education. This is a complicated terrain, but my commitment is that this forced choice is a false one. The dichotomy has undermined our ability to hear and understand legitimate criticism. People tend to read only in paradigm and tend to have uniform negative judgments about out-of-paradigm criticisms. A community speaking only to itself may develop unexamined in-house assumptions. The dichotomy has also marginalized joint and in-the-cracks perspectives and genders. At root, I am confident that a full treatment of learning and instruction must cover both individuals' thoughts, vested in brains, and the undeniably powerful effect of culture, interaction, physicality, for instance, external representations and human bodies. These are not optional perspectives, nor even strictly complementary ones. Each perspective completes the other, and in fact, they are probably not coherently construed independently." And he ends, "I do not believe everyone who thinks of him or herself as cognitive should immediately turn to the culture and interaction, or the reverse. But I think research that bridges the two perspectives, put them in proper relationships with each other, and research that now falls completely in the cracks needs a little boost." End quote. Last page. So, needing a little boost, the research I'll be discussing now falls well within that crack and explores that crack. We will witness the struggle of individual minds to make sense of cultural knowledge. Specifically, we will observe that students can do what they can do when deduction has failed them, and induction is still a few seconds away. Namely, we are interested in the nature of the logical operations that students apply in their attempt to reconcile their naive inferences from their perceptual judgments with the analytic structures of mathematical practice. I argue that we are witnessing students perform abduction as their authentic strategy for making sense of mathematical notions in ways that enable them to sustain their robust intuition and synthesize it with the cultural artifacts of mathematics. So let's look at some weapons of math instruction and what kids did with them. Okay. Shift gear. So I'd like to begin with a bit of data from one of these design-based research studies that we did on children's very early, sort of elementary school, grade 3, 4. They're beginning the sprouting of their understanding of proportionality and what might support that. Now, in this particular study, we developed a set of these cards that I should show you. And they are based on the rationale that we all have an inherent capacity to compare between objects that are proportionally equivalent. I mean, if you see, you come near and near to some object, it's going to grow proportionately. And it's not like if you're thinking every moment, oh, it's a new object, a new object, a new object. That is called object constancy. And the way we do it is, amongst others, we are supported by a cognitive mechanism that is sensitive to the proportions within objects, such as their aspect ratio. So what we did in this particular study is we started with a set of cards such as these. I mean, there are several sets, but this is sort of Danny and the Snowman. And we had the child select cards which seemed as if they were kind of the same, only bigger. And remember, these are kids who do not yet know the vocabulary of proportionality at all, and they're just starting multiplication now. But the idea was to give them cards such as these, right, and some distractors so that they would actually select a series. And we also gave them, fun and games, talk like a pirate day, this tool. Now, what this does, hooray, yeah, slightly embarrassed. What this does is it doesn't enable you to use your stereoscopic vision, which helps you see, to pick up depth cues, knows what is further than the other. So in a sense, if you take these two cards, which, well, I can tell they're proportional. It's like two different prints of the same photograph, if you will, and you close one eye, there is a point, well, it's kind of difficult to show you, but I'll kind of give them around. There's a point where you can pretty easily self-induce a sense of, let's try, close one eye. It's pretty easy to self-induce a sense that these cards are not only like somehow the same, only bigger, but they are actually identical, because the same retinal, the same picture falls on your retina, all right? Because one is big and far, and the other one is smaller and close. And so we work with these, and we chat with the kids around it. This is done in a kind of semi-clinical interview where I'm sitting with a child and speaking about these ideas and videotaping it. I have a certain protocol of questions I'm following, but I'll be happy to kind of sidestep when it looks kind of interesting of what's going on there. And then at some point we move away from these very detail-full objects with which we have, we have created like these series of a picture that are the same, only bigger, etc. And we move into these more kind of stark objects, such as these, which, again, there's less to kind of hold on to in terms of the snowman's shoulder or the kid's hat or something, but you're really using only this kind of perceptual judgment. They are the same. Oh, wait, the same, only bigger. And thus, creating some kind of criterion for the child of there's something going on here where kind of we're calling the idea of being the same, and it's evaluated according to this kind of criterion, which we call the eye trick. So we're working with this eye trick thing, okay? Now, there is also in this case a ruler, which for reasons that it's difficult to elaborate on right now, it's a stretchable ruler. Let me just find this. Is it? Ha! Yeah, abduction. Okay. So, yeah, so there will be a ruler involved, a little kind of measuring stick involved. You'll soon see it. Let me just bring this to a point where you'll see what I'm talking about. At some point, you'll be using a ruler to measure things, and it's a rubber ruler because, well, it had to stretch. So it's a ratio of 2 to 3. When stretched, became still a ratio of 2 to 3, only on larger objects. Yeah, scalability. So the point is that we are about to witness a, what's it, like a 120, just under a minute and a half of data, and we'll see it a couple of times, where what this child is doing is she's working with two cards. I think it's these or analogous to these, where she uses the ruler and measures that these are 2 units and 3 units tall, okay, in here. And she knows that these two are the same because she's done all that stuff and she knows it's the same. And now she is about to take the ruler and measure the other card. And what will happen here is that first she tries to make it again a unit apart, but then I can correct and she measures again and says, oh, wait, it's 2 units apart. And for this is for her a complete surprise. Okay? Because if they are the same, she says, how can it be like 1 unit apart here and 2 units apart here? How is that possible? They're the same. I know them to be the same. So she's in the moment of breakdown there, where all she had built up towards that moment was the idea of identity, and therefore, according to that sense of identity, internal parts and relations within each of the cards should also be identical, she expects. But here it's 1 and here it's 2. And so let's see what she does with that. Okay, we'll see it a few times. And okay.
So
not the same size. She says.
So what are they the same?
They're the same, like the picture.
I see. The picture is the same.
They're both the tall one and the little one. And if you do this and you say that this is like
The zeros here.
the 0,
Yeah. or
Like 6.
6?
But that's different.
Why
It's
is it
weird because this is 1 unit part and that's 2 units part.
Whoa! We have something important here. So you say,
And this is the same. If you take a picture of the building,
yeah.
and then this is 1 unit part and that's 2, isn't that weird?
It
It's
is.
the same building.
It is very weird. Let's not
But then, are these 2 going to be 3 apart? Because then it still might be the same building. This is 5.
Yeah, I think it's up to 6.
Yeah, 6. 9. That's 3.
That's 3.
So, the bigger the picture gets, the more units apart it is.
Yeah.
I know it's difficult to get all this stuff at once, so we're about to watch it again. But it starts out by the saying of these 2 cards. Oh, I forgot to say we're calling them buildings. This was something to hold on to. So it's the buildings, and then we come nearer. This is the buildings, and they're the same, etc. And she says, well, okay, so in what sense are they the same? They're the same picture. So it's like we took some picture and then we printed it out. And so she expects if this is 1 unit apart, then this should also be 1, but then it's 2. And she says, isn't that weird? If we took the picture, then if this is 1, shouldn't this also sort of be 1, but it's 2? And so what does she do? What does she do? She has no deduction to work with. She hasn't invented anything. She's groping there. And what does she pick up? She says suddenly, well, if in this card it's 3 units apart, then it could still be the same buildings. Do you realize how kind of weird that, how kind of radical it is? I mean, you could just say, oh, yeah, cool, and move on, but that's kind of what we do. It's this, the microgenetic analysis of what kids say and what it is that they are thinking, and where did that come from? Where the heck did she get this rule? A moment ago she said, there's no way, it cannot be. Let's just watch it again. It cannot be different. And then she says, like, complacently, she says, well, oh, but if it's 1, 2, 3, that's fine. Then they're still the same. My world is back the way it was. Let's just watch it, then I'll summarize this.
When you play back, can you unclip the mic and open your speaker?
Yes.
They're not the same size.
So what are they the same?
They're the same, like, the picture.
I see. The picture is the same.
They're both a tall one and then a little one. And if you do this and you say that this is like
The zeros here.
the zeros there,
Yeah.
and then this is 4, like 3.5.
It's 4.
Yeah, 4.
Mm-hmm.
Could say 4.
The tall
And
one.
then this is 5, so it's
Is
also
it
1,
5 or
like 6.
6? So
But that's different because
why
it's
is it
weird
different?
because this is 1 unit apart and that's 2 units apart.
whoa, we have something important here. So you
They
say
can't be the same if you take a picture of the building
yeah.
and then this is 1 unit apart and that's 2. Isn't that weird?
It
It's
is.
the same building.
It is very weird. Let's have
But then
this one.
are these 2 going to be 3 apart? Because then it still might be the same building. This is 5.
Yeah, I think it's up to 6.
Yeah, 6. 9. That's 3.
That's 3.
So the bigger the picture gets, the more units apart it is.
Yeah.
So this is the reason I like this little clip is that in 1.5 minutes, in just under 90 seconds, you go from complete confusion, surprise, to this kind of abduction of well, if only that were true, to okay, so let's check that. Oh, in the third one, it's also true. So here's the rule that from now on, and especially now that the interviewer said, yeah, she can actually use. So in a slightly more formal way. So again, in the terms of results and the rule and the case. And I'm following the work of Gary Shank here, who kind of interpolates little kind of words around the result and rule and case, just to help people understand the structure. So it goes something like this: result. Initially, I performed a perceptual comparison and established that cards B and card A, as well as their figurative content, are geometrically similar. So now that I have measured corresponding differences in height within the 2 cards, I'm surprised to discover that the difference in card B is bigger than in card A. Rule. And yet, if it were only true that, given a set of similar cards, the bigger the card, the bigger the difference, case, then it could still stand that card B is the same as card A, only bigger. Okay? I guess if there are any questions about this, this might be a good time, because I want to move on to a different kind of example. The point here is that coming in, she had no idea that she would be coming out with that rule. It's something that she groped for on the basis of these objects. Now, one could go back and say, well, where did she even bring that? Where does that idea come from? And both educational psychologists and cognitive scientists and philosophers have been speaking about this question of these, what is this a priori type of knowledge that kids bring to bear at this moment? And one way to talk about it is from the work of Dinah Tirosh and Ruth Stavy. They call it the more A, more B heuristic. Or another one is same A, same B. And these are kind of these primitive heuristic, these heuristic primitive rules that we entertain our mind, and perhaps we're not even aware that we do that. And what happens is when we're comparing two objects on the basis of some property, say, I don't know, two cars, asking which one drives faster. It's going to be a silly example. And we have no idea, so we grope for anything along which we can compare them, like they're both red. Which one is a darker red? Oh, that one is darker, so it's faster. Okay? I mean, along dimension x, which was color, darkness, we see that A is bigger than B. Oh, more here, so along this other one, A is bigger than B. Along fastness, A is bigger than B. And other times, it's same A, same B. If things are equivalent in some sense, so they're equivalent in another. And what happens here is that she shifts between these two modes, originally saying, oh, these are the same, okay, and therefore the distances should be the same, to a more elaborate understanding of this notion of sameness, of identity, which is, it's a particular kind of identity where it's okay to use the more A, more B. If this is bigger, then the difference should be bigger, the measured value should be different. And, sorry, is there a question here? No, yeah.
So, you seem to suggest from this piece of data that learning is a general type of thing. This induction is a rule. But really is learning in the perceptual sense, then it should be rather specific. So, if we were to transfer this child, for example, to the situation with the snowman, she shouldn't be able to do the same thing. She would have to learn the rule again for this new situation.
Okay, so what we're doing here is we're putting on the table a distinction between a logical operation in one instance and it's the extent to which it is consolidated and generative and sort of stable and portable and transferable to other situations. Now, I'm not making the claim that, okay, you know, check, she understands proportionality, let's move on to logarithms. It's not sort of that thing. It's about understanding at a very in a very nuanced way the mechanisms of learning, okay, so that we can inform the design of subsequent objects, materials, and ways of facilitating them, so that kids can come to reinvent these ideas, so that they can struggle. The key is here that she came in with one idea, and she had to struggle and then figure it out and sort of reconfigure her little bits of knowledge so that they could accommodate this new empirical data.
So does this struggle make it then this kind of knowledge more general, more durable?
Yeah.
Tangible way?
In a tangible, do you mean like measurable? Yeah. So yes. Well, first of all, I would say that the kind of proof is in the pudding, in the sense that in these kinds of episodes, you see kids stumbling upon mathematical ideas without them having been told the ideas. Okay, so they're reinventing these ideas, and as you move to other contexts, and they reinvent the idea there, they build up a repertory of cases where these new rules obtain, and through the mediation of vocabulary that you use across them, they come to notice analogies between situations that embody the same mathematical idea, even though they are contextually, sort of phenomenologically disparate. Okay, but certainly the program of measuring learning is key to this kind of empirical work. I'm just showing these kind of little moments, very specific little moments of discovery. Right? We can take that on later. So we'll move to a different design, and what I want to point out is that what I learned that kind of upon reflection that is typical of these kind of situations that I build is that the student comes in with the student is initially asked to perform some kind of perceptual judgment, and these perceptual judgments are based on innate or early capacities to compare between situations and evaluate whether or not they have the same kind of qualitative value along some selected dimension. In this case, it was between these objects. In some sense, they are the same, and they don't know to begin how to do it, how to articulate it mathematically. And the point is that here we were speaking about ratios. The ratios are the same of the magnitudes. The point is that in order to express this mathematically, one had to take the ratio, in this case, height, width, or, this was just height, and height. One had to measure each one of the parts separately. Measure this one and that one, and then express it as a ratio. And then measure this one and that one, and express it as a ratio. So that which was just an irreducible kind of quality of the sense of sameness had to be shifted to a different arena of mathematical analysis, where we actually measure the values and articulate them as a relation between two numbers. And so the struggle here is to synthesize between intuitive inference from perceptual judgments and the mathematical analysis, which requires articulation in terms of some ratio. And in the paper, I go into this comparison between intensive and extensive quantities, where basically intensive is a ratio that has no dimension, whereas extensive is something that you can actually measure. And I make the argument here, perhaps the key argument in terms of the teaching and learning of mathematics, that in order to truly deeply understand an intensive quantity such as slope or chance or density or ratio, one has to be in a situation where you are given tools to measure the internal parts, say if it's the A to B ratio, the A and the B, and then to see why this A to B description somehow relates to that felt sense you had. So we will move now to a different situation, and for this I need to give you some background. I notice it's 4:30, so, and we started late, so are you facilitating this? How shall I go about?
Well, how long do you think you need?
Oh, I could probably do this in like 7 minutes.
We've got until 5, and it'd be nice to have some time for questions.
Sure. So I'll take another about 7 minutes, and just so, because I think the contrast is nice to see that this kind of works in some completely different situation. Okay, thank you. So now we're moving to middle school, and we're moving from to a different intensive quantity, that of chance. And what we have here is a box full of hundreds of marbles that are either green or blue, and they're mixed, and they're the same amount of green and blue. And we have this object here, which I call the marble scooper. I used a 3D printer to create it. It's a cool thing because it enables you to sample out exactly 4 marbles in this case. Bless you. And they have a specific position within the sample. It's not like I sampled out 4 that they're kind of amorphous here. And without going into too many details, the point here was to scaffold for students the sense of order matters, that you should look at the order of the specific marble, because this kind of, I thought, looks very different from, say, well, the other one. Say, this one, which kind of feels like a different pattern. Anyway, to make a long story short, what happens is you give this to a middle school student, and who hasn't studied probability, and you say, what do you think this is? And they come up with all these ideas, fractions, I don't know, and so on. And then you say, well, I've got this thing, the scooper thing, and this is how it works. And what do you think will happen when I scoop? Okay, again, this is an intensive quantity. It's this it's in terms of the mathematics, it's the ratio between favorable outcomes and all of the marbles. Okay, and they say, well, they kind of look at it. Looks kind of half green-blue, and this scoop is 4, so 2 green and 2 blue. Okay. So how do you know that? I don't. It just looks like it. I picked it up. I don't know. Basically, they don't know, and that's fine. And Tversky and Kahneman call this the representative heuristic. You kind of look for, you name some kind of sample that feels as if it embodies the ratio properties or some kind of mechanism, dynamics of the stochastic device, the random generator, and you say that. Okay, and I might push them and say, well, what do you think about 4 green or 4 blue? Oh no, that's really rare to get 4 green and 4 blue. They don't yet have the sense. I can't help when I'm gesturing this kind of distribution because they don't yet have this sense of a histogram. They just kind of have this feeling. Okay, so then just like in the previous example, we go into a different activity when I give them these cards, empty cards, and crayons, and I say to them, could you show me all the things that we could get? So. It's kind of asking them to do the combinatorial analysis to build the sample space. And so they go through with the motions, and they build all of them, and they come up with these kinds of cards that they create, okay? There's like a thick line here to show that rotation matters. And now I use this. This is not something the kids ever see. I just use it in presentations because it's inconvenient showing cards to people sitting there. So I don't know if people can see this. What they create on the table eventually, I ask them to assemble in this form, which I call the combinations tower. So they build this thing. Now the curious thing is, the moment they see this, by and large, the students, these are grade 4, 5, 6, look at this, take one look and say, oh yeah, something like, this is kind of what I was telling you before, you see, because there are more ways of getting more ways of getting 2 green, 2 blue than there are of getting, say, 3 green or 4. That's why we'll get it more. Now, I just want to impress upon you that the analogy to the previous one, if she, Aliyah, I'm calling her, was looking at this unarticulated proportion thing and then had to measure and then suddenly figured out how to coordinate between those measures and this qualia. Here again, the child could not explain how he is determining the sort of intuitive distribution, and yet the moment the events are folded out in terms of their analytically derived permutations and set up as a complete sample space, he somehow finds a way of connecting this structure with that felt sense of distribution. And there are all kinds of explanations for that moment. One of them is an interesting one from Edwin Hutchins from San Diego, who speaks about this as constituting a material anchor for a conceptual blend, meaning something about the relative magnitude invited the investing this artifact, this collective artifact, with that sense of relative distribution. So yeah, this is the most, this is less. And I want to show you a case, and with that we'll finish that kind of data. And if you don't mind, I'm going to switch off the slide, because I just think is that okay with people? Yeah? Okay. Thanks. This is so much better. What you'll see here is that this particular student is fighting these 11 cards. He will say, well, to begin with, I only spoke about the 5 things you can get. No green, 1 green, 2 green, 3 green, or 4 green. So what up with all these permutations you asked me to make? Like, why are we even bothering looking at all the different permutations if the question was about the events, okay? Now, mathematically, of course, we have to know how many permutations there are in order to figure out the proportions. But he doesn't see why I'm taking him into that. Just as Aliyah in the previous sample didn't quite see initially what this measuring has to do with the sense of proportion. So with this, this is I think a 2.5 or 3 minute clip. With this, we'll end this part of the meeting, which there are more cases than you might see in the paper. But again, I think I've brought through the key points that I wish to share, and we can go and speak on afterwards.
Audio.
Excuse me. Oh, there. Here we go. You see this, and you say the chance of getting scooping something with 2 green is 1 out of 5. I should have said a word about that. He had initially said that 2 green, 2 blue is the most likely, but the moment he started building the combinatorial and the sample space, he shifted his idea and said, well, actually, it's flat. They're equally likely to get each one of the 5. And I cannot go into detail right now, but it's a fascinating moment of interaction between intuition and the media, especially between intuition and the available semiotic means of objectification, as Louis Radford calls it. But at this point, he's going back and forth. Now he thinks for a moment that's 1 out of 5.
Actually, yeah.
Okay.
Actually, that seems like it would be 6 out of 16.
Huh. Okay, so what? So 1 out of 5 now went to 6 out of 16. What?
Well, it's like.
That's quite a difference.
Yeah. Well, there are 60. Well, actually. No, I think still would be 1 out of 5.
So if I scoop about 1/5 of the time, I'll get something with 2.
2 of each.
Okay. So
Because, like, these don't really matter.
in what sense?
Well, if you're looking to... Well, if the placement mattered, these would matter, but these are all the same thing. These are the same thing as this, except for the placement.
Mm-hmm.
So
Well,
it's the same original 5, or like any one of these. That matters.
So, I mean, this issue of placement, that seems to be what it's not just like you and me deciding, let's use placement or let's not use placement. It's like, how does that relate to the situation in the world, like the scooping? Should we care about placement or not? And it seems like you're saying not.
Yeah.
Okay, so your prediction is that if we scoop, say, I don't know, 100 times, we'll get about 20 of these, 20 of these, 20 of these, 20 of these, 20 of these.
Actually, no. I'm going back to. There's. Out of all the possibilities you can get, 6 out of 16 are 2 and 2.
Mm-hmm.
And then these are only 1 out of 16.
Mm-hmm.
So, like what I was saying, 1 out of 5 chance, that would mean. Cause you'll get these more than these, because there's 6 of these and there are only 1 of these.
Mm-hmm.
So that would mean that you would get about 20% of. Well, you would get 20% of the 4 greens and 4 blues. But now I'm realizing that's not true.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Okay. So he shifts from thinking that he needs only 5 events in order to speak about his feeling of distribution, to speaking of the groups and somehow smearing that sense of intuitive distribution that comes from the context of scooping, somehow smearing it upon the entire collection of each group. So I think this is a good moment to stop. And thanks. There are more. There's another case in this which is online. I also put the Gary Shank paper online if you want to read more about abduction. So thank you very much for this opportunity to share these ideas with you. I understand we will be going up. We're having discussion now and so on.
Should we sort of do questions for 15 minutes or so? And then
Please.
Move upstairs.
That's fine. Yeah, sure.
Coffee and stuff. So,
Sure.
you can sort of field your own questions.
I'm sure. So, yeah.
start. I'm struck by the fact that these are, of course, the kinds of things that Jean Piaget was asking at various ages. In the picture, ages are carefully selected here so that the older student would not have struggled with the first one and so on.
Yeah.
The first case is very much like his conservation tests. Given this, now let's assume that this is a kind of abduction that's going on. I'm assuming you know something, you know Piaget's stage theory is sort of argument. This would suggest that certain kinds of abductions can be done at certain ages more effectively than others. And that as you move up in age, so this student would be talked about as beginning his formal stage in Piaget, saying that, you know, this might be able to be done at age 10 or 12, but you couldn't do this if you were age 7. What does that tell you about maturation and kinds of abduction? Because these are different kinds of abduction in that sense.
Well, thanks. So I think that we are speaking about the same basic mechanism, only the types of particular observations or kinds of perceptual intuitions that can be articulated may change from age to age. And so I should begin by saying that, of course, Jean Piaget's stage theory has been contested, and we're now at the point where we have the neo-Piagetians and so on. And one of the problems with his work that is relevant to, well, of course, for those who don't know, Jean Piaget is considered like the father or grandfather of cognitive developmental studies. He was Swiss. Though he called himself a genetic epistemologist. He started out by working on mollusks, and his first paper, I think, was at the age of 11, where he detected some birds, new species in Geneva, and wrote about it in some journal, and gives you perspective, yeah. And his question was, like, starting from mollusks and moving up in the biological ladder, what does it mean to learn? What does it mean to come to understand? What does it mean to be equipped with the mental wherewithal in order to survive and adapt to one's environment? And how does this actually happen? And that is your allusion to the conservation task for all those. I'm sure you've seen it in some context, where you've seen it with your own kids or nephews or brothers or what have you, where you have a tall glass of water. Then you pour it into an empty, sort of low glass of water, and the child will say, okay, now we have less. Okay, whereas for adults it's absurd, but for the child will say, no, it's less, it's lower, it's less. And so the point, one of the arguments against Piaget's stage theory is that already in the beginning, in the 80s and 90s, people such as Spelke and Starkey and Bayer-Jean and Gelman, and now people like fake Xu actually on this campus, show that kids of a very young age have certain capacities, which, of course, it would be absurd to call them mathematical in the sense of some kind of reified discipline, but they are tantamount to enabling the kinds of perceptual judgments that underlie the kinds of assertions that these students are making. So, for example, in a paper by Xu and Vashti, they show that 8-month-old babies performed in the same way on a experiment that is, of course, arranged in a completely different way, but is analogous to this, where there was some kind of box and little marbles ran out and into a kind of a chamber which had order, and these babies were more surprised when they got, say, I think the colors were actually green and blue. When they got like 4 green, they kind of stopped drinking or whatever that was they were doing. What's called in cognitive psychology called they dishabituated. They dishabituated when it was what they thought of as rare, or if you will, when it was a rare event, even though all the 16 are equiprobable according to theory. So I would say that it's the same kinds of perceptual intuitions that are being recruited, and I would say that it's the same structure of logical operation that's being recruited. However, what is different is what are the available constructs for them to express these ideas. And if they had not, or put another way, as the children develop, they consolidate more and more complex mathematical constructs, which then become their sort of semiotic means of objectifying these pre-symbolic notions. So naturally, if a child has never seen a fraction, they won't go, oh yes, that's 3/4 of, because they don't even have that available as a way of speaking about what they see. So they might have to use something much simpler. They'll just count this is 1 and this is 3 and so on. So the very construct of a fraction is not available for them to use. Therefore, we do see, even though the different cases are analogous in terms of the operations and the type of these qualia that are recruited and impressed, the types of mathematical vocabulary and construct that are available to them will change over the years as the children develop and, well, learn and consolidate these ideas.
And you couldn't do this on the 4-year-old, though. So my question...
Well, it's an empirical question.
The fact that there's a difficulty question here, as well as a logical inference structure question. And is the difficulty, for example, something we call M space, the problem of how many factors you can hold in your head at once before you can do that?
So when I was alluding to this idea of whether or not the idea of fraction is available, I was kind of touching upon something you might think of as like just the sheer cognitive load and the working space of, actually Peirce has this nice construct of what he calls the hypostatic abstraction, which is when you build a model of a situation, you can then look at this model and notice patterns between the components, which represent aspects of the model, that were not available for you before. You build this and you build this, and suddenly you just kind of sit back and say, oh my gosh, it's 1 4 6 4 1, or this is half more than that, or this is 2 more than that. So all kinds of relations which were not available for you there. And you might say something about, specifically in hypostatic abstraction, you might use some adjective to describe what you're seeing here, and then that adjective becomes a noun that is then you borrow for new situations. So you might say something about this, oh, it's spread out in this way, it's spread out in that way. And now we move on, we say, okay, the spread in the previous one. So I no longer need to say about how this is, the aspect ratio, and there are more here, and speak about the range and the variability. I just said spread. Now I can compare between two situations that have different spread. So that hypostatic abstraction is the moment of consolidating an adjective as a noun, as a property that can then be compared to another situation. And also he speaks of the collateral, not damage, collateral knowledge, meaning that it is not the case that you discover something and there you just know it, but you are you're thickening your ties within his triad of the representation and the object and the representation. You keep on building more and more richer ties, so that which is the expression of your progressing knowledge. And for Peirce, there's no such thing as this abstract concept thing. He speaks about mathematical objects. You are inventing and discovering and discussing mathematical objects. It's always an object. It's always a thing you're talking about, the properties of a thing. Have I got to that round? Yeah.
A couple questions. One about whether you've done any evaluations of the retention of knowledge learned this way, and also how you would distinguish this from traditional teaching. There's something Socratic about this, and one could say that there's actually a spectrum in which abduction is exhibited all the way from command, where a teacher simply says, this is how things are, which is more like positive deductions, all the way to the most heuristic Montessorian sort of tactile experimental thing. Anytime you engage a student in a query, anytime they get actually engaged in the topic enough to wonder and then come to some conclusion, there seems to be some abduction going on, if only vicariously, from watching a teacher wonder, for example, in front of the class. So on that continuum, you seem to be arguing that there's a specific novel technique here, and also suggesting that there would be better retention or something like that resulting from that. I wonder if you could speak to that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So, yeah, I like that characterization of the two poles between the very traditional frontal, let's just read this and do it kind of thing, to the very, as I characterize it, caricatured, I should say. Here's some stuff, or reinvent the world. I'm going off for coffee. But so that, in fact, a major part of my work is in trying to articulate principles for a specified methodology of design, which, and it's attempts to be unique in that it not only specifies what a pedagogical philosophy is, such as kids should learn bottom up and etc., but it actually gives very specific principles for how one should go about creating these and facilitating these environments. So yes, I agree with you that there is a certain pattern here, and that is to enable kids to start by asserting propositions about the nature of objects in front of them that are in fact mathematically sound, so that they do not start by making a statement that would then be characterized as a misconception, as you see in Tversky and Kahneman's work. So well, I won't go into that. But the point is that the designs I've been working on are just there. And in order to get to that kind of place where the child will experience cognitive conflict and this basic kind of generative confusion, I create these kinds of objects that I think of as ambiguous in some sense. For instance, these cards, at one moment you might think of it as the specific 2x2 sort of matrix that has blue in the bottom right-hand corner. Another moment you might think of it as, oh, the 3 green, the event of 3. So it's either combination or permutation. And actually we're seeing in our data that kids do not realize that they are mentally constructing this objective thing in the world, that they're flipping between these constructions. And it's actually the flipping between these constructions which informs their assertions about the distribution, such as we see here as he's moving back and forth. So certainly there is I guess Socratic. Well, I don't think I wouldn't characterize as Socratic in terms of asking him rhetorical questions about whether or not he knows something about the properties of the world, but rather I would say that I take specific care in order to bring a child to a moment of generative cognitive conflict, where the available tools around the available sort of semiotic means of objectification are such that he or she can then articulate their confusion in ways that hone it to the point where they realize that actually they're looking at 2 different constructions of the same object, and that the truth lies in the synthesis, in the reconciliation, as Wilson calls or consilience of 2 views on the world. So that's to that question of the design principles. In terms of evaluation, there are other studies in which I conducted a more kind of formal sort of post-test. In fact, that particular one, the kids were building the sample space not of the what I call the 4 block, right? Not of the 16, but actually of the 9 block, where there are 512, sort of 1, 9, 36, 84, 126, 126, 36, 18, and so on. 9 different categories, and they built it. 2 6th grade classes built it together, and after that, I gave them as a post-test questions about these kinds of about the 4 block that we had discussed. And so there are various ways of getting at these, evaluating what it is that they know. I do pursue these kinds of assessments. At this point, what I'm most interested is in characterizing the nature of the moments that lead to these kinds of insights. But certainly within a major component of the approach within which I work, which is design-based research, and was actually initially articulated as a means of going into a classroom, not just in a sort of a Piagetian kind of laboratory, and dealing with the richness and diversity and chaos of a learning situation. And so I do hold myself accountable to issues of empiricism of assessment. Lisa.
Yes, I would like to understand a little bit better how the cases you presented for us fit into your larger, let's call it theoretical framework. So you have this, started by talking about the distinction between a cognitive approach and a socio-cultural approach.
Yeah.
And this much seems clear that in your first example, the person is intuitively judging just by looking at the cards that they are in some sense the same. And then what happens subsequently is that they try to connect up measurement to this.
Yeah.
I think that's how I would put it in a minimal way.
Mm-hmm.
It's not completely clear that what the measurement part need necessarily be socio-cultural. I would just say it's a connection of what one just intuitively immediately sees and measurement.
Okay, so one could speak of measurement as, especially in the case of continuous quantities such as line or, distance or mass or luminosity, where it is not discrete, one perforce has to apply some kind of conventional unit or even an ad hoc unit for comparison. Okay, so the very notion of measurement as an act is using some unit is already an intervention of culture. Now, you do see, say, I think primates using, say, a stick to measure a hole, but they are not. It's not that in that sense. It's not. People here have read much more about measurement than I have, but it's not in the sense of there are discrete units that we will then apply to some other place, but just to get a sense of that depth. Okay. Now, but more cogently, the very idea of applying measurement to the case where that which we had been judging was just identity of objects, it is something that intervenes. If you will, outside of mathematical practice, we don't need to do that. We just happily rely on our qualitative assessments. And it is only the particular discursive structure of that moment and the pragmatics of situation that are demanding of the student to engage in these measurement activities that enable her to reconstruct, or if you will, synthesize. I prefer that because I believe those intuitions, I'm not alone in that intuitions never actually go away, but to articulate analytic aspects of the situation, in this case, the height of these particular buildings, and the difference between the heights, as something that is worthy of attention to. And very often in these kind of studies, there's this moment of suspended pertinence, we have called it, where they're engaged in some activity, but they're not quite sure yet where it is going or why they're doing it. And yet, at that moment of the aha, is the moment of synthesis, of seeing how they are related.
Okay, I think that's right. I know the time is up, but let me just ask one quick follow-up. Now turning to the case of probability.
Yeah.
It was less clear to me, and looking at my own history, it is not obvious that the 20% is what one is a lot like intuitive judgments of similarity in the first case of the cards and the bars.
Mm-hmm. So may I?
Yeah.
Okay. So
in other words, those two cases seem to have a different structure. It's not like there's an obvious intuitive case where everybody would judge immediately that these two to be the same. Is it really true that everybody automatically, immediately, intuitively judges 20%?
The specific percentages were actually a kind of they were epiphenomenal to the moment of confusion where he took it to be flat. Actually, what happened there was that he had said that the distribution is what we would call this, okay, but only that 2 green, 2 blue are the plurality, and 4 green or 4 blue are rarer. But then the moment he engaged these semiotic means of objectification, these actual cards, and he created these 5, and then looks at them and says, well, actually, I'm changing my mind. I think they're only 1 in 5. And what's very interesting about that moment is that because he had the means in order to show what the 5 are, but there was no like a legend or no contract as to how one might tag the relative distribution. There was no way of saying this is more or this is forward or this is somehow more intense. That moment is sort of gone. It was like it was ephemeral. And then he kind of blinks his eyes and looks at it again, and all he sees is 5 objects, and therefore he says it's just 1 in 5. And the 20% is an elaboration on that. So that kind of took a tangent away from the main structure, which is the collection of all the 16. That said, I used the percentage possibly because I earlier on, and this was about, I think, half an hour into the conversation. I usually make a point of only using vocabulary that kids have already brought up, so probably the question of percentage may have come up. But specifically to your question, the analogy here is that just as here one can make just a perceptual judgment and never bother to measure anything, never bother to analyze the constituents, if you will, A and B in the A to B ratio, which makes up these are equal in the sense that they have the same structural ratio inside, or aspect ratio here. Just so, as long as one's working with these marbles, one doesn't see any need to look at the permutations, and that is the analog in terms of applying the procedure of combinatorial analysis, which is analytic and looks at and says, no, we do need to care for order. And he was not at all alone. I use him as a case study because he was completely typical of students not knowing why it is that they're bothering about the permutations and repudiating the very notion of combinatorial analysis as being kind of a bit absurd, seeing as they were asked about the events. Why are they looking? And therefore, just as she goes, oh, okay, if the world were only this way, then, okay, now I understand how this fits. So with him, when he goes and says, okay, and he shifts from, linguistically, he shifts from speaking about it, is one out of, he speaks about these are 6 out of 16. These will happen more often. And so the sort of the superordinate category of an event is born and somehow synthesized with the intuitive construct of the things that you could get, which had never been specified prior to the experiment.
Thank you, sir. Amplifying that, my guess is that at the beginning of this, if you would have asked him, what are you more likely to get? 2, 1, or 3, or 4, he would have immediately said 2, but much more likely.
Which is indeed what he said.
I'm sure he did. So in some sense, that's the perceptual or the subitizing move. In other words, to just see the similarity between the proportions. The second piece, it looks as though he's confused by the move to symbolizing. That is, the symbolizing it allows him to say, oh, I have to abstract away from that. And then he looks at the permutations, and he loses his subitized knowledge, so to speak. His intuitive knowledge. So I would say in the first case, there really is something similar, a perceptual similarity that's recognized. And he seems to get confused as he moves through it. That would be my interpretation of it.
Well, we can go on with it, but I mean, the idea of confusion is well, we can continue later. I know that some people may have to leave, but let's continue this.
Okay, well, yeah, so let's thank you very much, and good luck.